In his compelling documentary, Weed.
You've looked at the evidence.
There is real science now out there.
He was flat out wrong about weed.
A year-long journey that changed what many of us thought about marijuana, myself included.
I think, we've been terribly and systematically misled.
We used to only picture this. Then we showed you this. Medical marijuana, treating seizures, pain, dozens of other ailments.
Charlotte's doing amazing, just better and better each month.
But we learned this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning.
I think we went from about 150 calls a month to over 4,000.
There are still so many issues to be addressed. The federal government says marijuana is among the most addictive drugs with no medicinal value. Many serious scientists say they're wrong.
It's a medicine.
It's the politics of pot, pitting policy against patients. Trapped in the middle, sick, qualified people who want medical marijuana but can't get it because it's illegal.
If you try to go back to Ohio with Jordan's medication,
Will be arrested.
All for a plant that you're going to see can work wonders for pain in a grown man, MS in a woman at the peak of her life, and seizures in a little girl. We traveled the globe asking scientists, patients, and policymakers for a solution. I'm Dr. Sanjay Gupta, and this is Weed 2, Cannabis Madness. This time our journey begins in New Jersey, ironically called the Garden State. It's the summer of 2013, a quiet neighborhood diner about to become the site of a headline-making confrontation. Between a frantic father, Brian Wilson, and the outspoken governor, Chris Christie, all over Wilson's 2-year-old daughter, Vivian.
I was wondering what the holdup is. It's been like 2 months now, or a month and a half.
Because
it's very well documented.
Excuse me, these are complicated issues.
Very simple issue.
Listen, no, I know you think it's simple.
It was a David and Goliath moment. You've got a governor who's one of the leading Republicans in the nation, and this dad who's got a little girl who he's desperately worried and in love with, who just wants to do the best thing for her.
You see, Brian Wilson's daughter, Vivian, was dying. Her brain continuously locked in seizures, and nothing had worked. The Wilsons were now pinning their hopes on medical marijuana. They'd read about marijuana on the internet, and they saw stories about it saving lives. Like little Charlotte Figge, whose story was told in our first documentary, Weed.
I remember I was actually at the gym on the treadmill, and I saw a preview. I was watching the TV. I was so excited because I knew that everything was going to change at that moment.
They hoped marijuana would rescue Vivian from the virtual prison she lives in, where bright lights, loud sounds, and patterns can all induce a seizure. That's why she wears that patch on her eye.
I say if Vivi could be blindfolded, she'd be seizure-free because it's everything. It's all visual stimuli. She can't leave the house.
Vivian, do you know this book?
Vivian and I first played together in her darkened, quiet, very controlled bedroom. It quickly became clear how tremendous a toll this isolation takes on Vivian. But also the entire family. No one here has a normal life, including Vivian's older sister, 4-year-old Adele.
Like every day on the way home from school, she's like, can we stop at the park? And I'm like, we can't stop at the park because Vivian's nurse leaves at 5 and we have to be home.
What would Adele say about that?
She'll say, we can't, when we pass the park, she says, those kids are at the park, but we can't go to the park because Vivian has seizures. And it like kills you, you know?
They're so severely affected.
New York University neurologist Dr. Oren Davinsky is Vivian's doctor. He's also one of the world's leading epilepsy experts.
I think for the families who have given Western medicine a really good chance, and there are a lot of them, and Western medicine has failed their children.
But the Wilsons now found themselves in the political crossfire of pot. Marijuana was legalized for medicinal use here in New Jersey right before Christie took office in January of 2010. It was done by his Democratic predecessor. But once in office, Christie blocked the legislation for more than a year. He eventually signed one of the strictest, most limiting medical marijuana bills to date. Just 6 approved stores in the entire state, and perhaps most damaging for Vivian, no edible forms of marijuana allowed, which was crucial. The only option then for this 2-year-old would be to inhale it.
Talk to Brian Wilson.
Protests erupted across the state. And that's why Brian Wilson took things into his own hands that day in August.
We've had our experts reach out to you. Have you heard from our doctors?
I've read everything that's been put in front of me, and I'll have...
It became known as the dust-up in the diner.
I mean, it was all over CNN. It was national news. It was like Libya, Vivian Wilson's father on the CNN home. I mean, it was crazy.
She's the one my daughter died, Governor.
Hi, how are you?
Nice to meet you.
Good to see you.
It's a battle these families understand better than anyone.
There's no hope left in Miami. There was nothing else to do.
Each of these families wanted medical marijuana for their sick children. They also fought to get it in their home states, but lost. So they moved to Colorado where it's legal. Desperate and determined, they've become known as medical marijuana refugees.
I came from Arizona.
We left a lot back in Alabama.
Unfortunately, we had to break the news to his folks that we're not going to be coming back to Texas.
More than 100 families moving to get the marijuana they had seen in our last documentary. It's called Charlotte's Web, named for the little girl we profiled. It's a plant that doesn't get you high, but is loaded with a chemical called cannabidiol, or CBD, which seems to help reduce seizures, even when nothing else has worked. It changed Charlotte's life.
Because the drier it is, it'll extract more.
Thousands of parents called to ask the growers, Josh Stanley and his brothers, if it could possibly work for their children.
And you tell them, potentially, it could. Nothing's for sure. And I said, well, unfortunately, you have to move to Colorado.
And the reason they have to move to Colorado is what?
Because anything that's grown in Colorado has to stay in Colorado.
It's the most absurd idea that we would have to do this to get medicine.
But it's the law. Marijuana is illegal federally. So even if you're prescribed it legally in a medical marijuana state, even if it works, even if it is your last hope, you're out of luck. You can't carry it across state lines. So for the Wilsons, completely uprooting their lives and moving seemed to be the only option to help Vivian.
It's the hardest thing in the world to have to do. We have all of our family here. We have our job. There's so much that we'd have to do.
But just weeks after the dust-up in the diner, just around the time the Wilsons allowed us to start filming their story exclusively, we received word that Governor Christie had eased his stance.
Madam Speaker, Senate Bill 2842 has received 70 votes in the affirmative, 1 in the negative, and 4 abstentions.
Eventually, the state of New Jersey did allow the edible form of marijuana after all. But the Wilsons still had another roadblock. They couldn't get their doctors to prescribe it.
There's a certain level within the epilepsy community of just fear that you could do more harm than good, and until you go through the standard process, you should be conservative.
And by standard process, he means scientific research. And as you're about to learn, that is nearly impossible to conduct here in the United States.
It's time to reform the system.
I love you so much. Have fun on the airplane.
Leaving people like the Wilsons in a painful and potentially deadly limbo. The exclusive journey to save their daughter when we come back. It's high noon at the Indispensary in Colorado Springs. Business is booming at one of the state's largest medical marijuana dispensaries. Customers run the gamut of ages and ailments.
Busy day. It's always a busy day, yes, sir.
Each strain